All right. Hello to the internet. I'm Willow Brew, and we're going to do a screencast. I don't know what these are called about Weaponized Social today. And we have Ed and Meredith with us. And what we're looking at is how did we even get to the idea of Weaponized Social and the tensions that are behind why we thought we needed something like this. And one of the components of that uh, might not be the core component of our conversation today, but it's certainly an aspect of the larger conversation, which is how did we even get here? The term social justice warrior has ended up being a derogatory term, which I find funny because I like society and justice and warriors for complex reasons, but I wanted to know why it seems like a bad thing to some people. And so uh, we're going to talk about that some today. And I will be facilitating and also sort of participating. My name is Willie Brew. I am the community leadership strategist at Aspiration Tech, which I didn't even realize I had worn one of our t-shirts today, but that is what it is. Ed, who are you?
Hello, my name is Ed Platt, as you know, Willow, and I am a former hackerspace founder, administrator, former civic technologist, professionally, current civic technologist for fun, and PhD student at the University of Michigan School of Information. And basically, I'm here because I like being parts of communities that function well, and I'm interested in how to build them and maintain them.
So Meredith, how about you?
I'm Meredith Patterson. I'm a software engineer and security researcher. Um, and I think my network. Okay, no, somebody just came on. That's cool. Yeah, so I'm a software engineer and security researcher, and mostly I work on problems having to do with how computers talk to each other. But given that all computers are programmed by humans, and humans frequently run into challenges trying to communicate with each other. This ends up translating into the tech world. So I've found my research starting to expand into human communication breakdown as well as machine communication breakdown.
Wonderful, thank you. And Lori was just able to join us, and I have done some introductory material in the right-hand side. Um, is that sufficient framing for you to jump in? Cool, go for it. Hey!
I think you mostly know me. Ed and Willow know me quite well. Meredith, I think you've met me at Molly's one time.
Yes, without
Yeah, I'm a journalist and various kinds of feminist, and I write and think a lot about tech. But I guess I'm not as knowledgeable as some people on the actual insider stuff. But I guess most of my friends do computery things. Also, I've got new glasses. Do you like them? I just got them from the internet.
They're wonderful, which means Ed is the only person here who's not wearing glasses, which is the only way that he's different than the rest of us. Um, all right, so Meredith, would you be willing to set up the conversation? It started with a thread with Jonathan, you, and myself, or rather between you and Jonathan that I later got opted into, which I was delighted about. Where your network might be suboptimal. All right, so I'm going to try to frame this while Meredith's network connection catches up, which is that social justice has a lot of different versions of meaning. I am not well versed in those histories, and so I will be humble to the people who have far more background in that than I do. But my basic understanding is that liberal social justice was a baseline of human rights movements of everyone deserves access to equal rights. We're humans, hooray. And then identity politic social justice was a critique of that, which said, hey, if we give everyone the same sort of thing, there are actually people that, because of history, won't be able to utilize that in the same way. And so we need to be aware of differences in background uh, when we deploy this baseline for everyone. And as identity politics so identity politics are sort of relational, and as that has become the main focus, we've stopped looking at where the baseline is and where it should be. Meredith, is your connection caught up, and can you fill in gaps?
Yeah, I think I might have also just forgotten to unmute. So the other thing that Jonathan and I have talked about recently is the identity politics. But and of course, political ideology has its members who want to push to get everybody else to give up their own preferences and accept the ideology's preferences. But I find this has as well to be way more common among social justice practitioners, particularly ones who are coming from an identity politics framework. Um, I mean, this is pretty challenging to me, because for one thing, I'm autistic, and mapping on, trying to get myself to fit into any group of people is difficult enough on its own. Much less when I'm being told, hey, you have to get rid of all of your, you have to replace all of your existing preferences with the ones that appropriate, otherwise we're going to cast you out of society. I mean, that's very much the impression that the identity politics wing of the left gives off to people on the outside of it, like myself. And so we wanted to talk about sort of where that impulse comes from and the effects that it has on, particularly with respect to the more liberal strain of the movement that Willow was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So that to me is reminiscent of Emile Durkheim, who's an old school sociologist who talked about something called anomie, which was when we stop having distinct groups in groupings, we end up having breakdowns of social norms. And that I'll just throw that out there. Lori, what do you think?
Well, I would say that the first thing that strikes me is that I only really ever hear identity politics used as a definitional term by people outside what they perceive as identity politics. Like, I don't ever describe myself as somebody who does identity politics.
Jonathan actually does.
Oh,
Jonathan actually does, so I think there are people
So
who do self-describe this way.
We're gonna have to stagger things because we're online. So we're gonna let Lori do an entire thought, and then I'll jump in things.
honestly, yeah, I don't know very many people who define as identity politics. Like, it's normally used as a criticism, whereas a lot of people who, for example, are involved in anti-racism work and in feminist work would say, it's not so much that I do identity politics, I do politics. And I feel like it's often phrased that politics that is relevant to, like, to what is sometimes called the baseline, but is often, a white male middle class way of thinking about things. That's how we define the baseline is problematic in and of itself. I would say that is just called politics, whereas politics which is less immediately relevant to a white male middle class straight understanding of things is not allowed to be politics. It has to be identity politics. It has to be to the side. And I guess one thing is it's about reframing the baseline. I call myself a social justice warrior now, but only because I quite like the term, and I heard it I heard it used first as a way of mocking people who care about different kinds of social justice. And I think, hey, what's the problem with being a social justice warrior? So I guess my question would be, what aspects of identity politics per se are threatening as opposed to non-identity politics?
Meredith and then Ed.
Well, sure, I'd be happy to speak to that actually. There, Willow recently recommended to me a book that I found really interesting and enjoyed quite a lot. It's called Missing Class: Strengthening Social Movement Groups by Seeing Class Cultures, by a sociologist named Betsy Leondar Wright.
Mhm.
And she certainly, I mean, she was an anti-nuke activist for a long time. You know, she's still an activist in many different in many different communities, and she, you know, she takes the identity, you know, the identity politics framing, you know, unironically. I mean,
Mhm.
she sees the groups that she is working with as, you know, some of them seem to be focused on, you know, some of them are focused on class issues.
Mhm. Oh
No.
But more of them are focused on such, and you know, she differentiates this from matters of socioeconomic status. There's another book that I also read very recently by Walter Ben Michaels, called "The Trouble with Diversity: How We Learned to love identity and ignore inequality." And that's really the danger that I see in in focusing on um, immutable aspects of a person's of a person's uh, personhood, I guess,
yeah.
as the grounds from which we start our politics, because it erases important distinctions about the quality of life that people are having. I mean, there's income inequality among white people. There's income inequality among Black people. And one of the things that both Michaels and Leander Wright point to is that, by and large, identity-focused activism provides the most benefits to people who are already, who are already upper,
Mhm.
professional class, or the working class people who disadvantages. They get the warm fuzzies of people saying, yes, we're going to pay more attention to the problems of lower income people, but attention doesn't really put food on the table.
Okay, Ed.
All right, so I really like the question about what people see as the harm in identity politics, and aside from obvious bad faith criticisms, the danger that I've seen is that it can be used to silence, and there was an article I came across on the Oppression Olympics, which I think should be required reading for everyone. Um, and I think if there's a difference between saying the baseline is not really fair to everyone, and saying you don't belong to this particular group, therefore you cannot participate, or you have no value to contribute. And I see that as a kind of an ineffective way for people to work together. And I had one other thought that hopefully is still in my brain.
Just trying to hook it out.
Yeah. Which is, maybe I'll jump in later if I remember it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that was a good question. That got me thinking.
No, so that reminds me of one of the reactions I've had to the Black Lives Matter being rebutted with All Lives Matter is like, then why is it painful to say that Black Lives Matter? Like, why can't we say that? And why can't we focus on where we know the damage is the most right now? So has anyone else navigated that?
Well, Black Lives Matter thing. Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
I was trying to puzzle this out in a kind of space with a friend who's also white, to say lately, and saying, like, so what is the problem with this? And I think it comes across the best way we found to phrase it is, it's a bit like going up to somebody at the funeral of a relative and saying, I too have suffered, right? Like, well, loudly interrupting a funeral to say, I too have suffered. Um, which is, it's like, yes, it's, both those things are true, but if you're trying to make a specific point, saying all lives matter, as opposed to Black Lives Matter, as opposed to just beside it, it's self-silencing. But I guess to your point, Ed and Meredith, about identity politics versus class, I'm kind of in some ways the wrong person to come back about this, or the right person, I don't know, because a lot of the work I do, certainly within feminism, is about trying to merge the two. The book I wrote most recently is partly about the fact that too much of contemporary feminism has focused exclusively on, like you say, on problems focused on problems experienced by white upper class women from English speaking countries, and to the detriment of everybody else. And I tend to think that, like, I'm a socialist, well, an anarchist, because I'm a feminist, not the other way around. Like, I just got to a phase with feminist thought and reading, which, it just didn't make sense not to also be extremely concerned with issues of inequality. And the same for anybody talking about race in America is, I think, particularly within the anti-racism movement, there's much more of a understanding that this is not just about skin color. This is about how class is predicated along lines of race and also of gender. Not always, but this is economics instrumentalizes identity, I think, is a way of putting it. Identity is related to class and socioeconomic status. Like, for example, in the United States, the whole idea of white versus black, and these aren't actually biological categories. There's no gene for race. But the whole idea of white versus black became hugely important around the time that, well, firstly with slavery, and secondly with the abolition of slavery, when it was important for landowners to stop solidarity happening between white and black working class people. It was much more important to institute those laws to keep people apart so they wouldn't come together and overthrow, like, the powerful rich people. So that's my thinking on, and I tend to think that I tend to agree that identity politics that exclusively focuses on, on issues that affect, all kinds of classes of a certain identity group, is less useful. However, I don't think that means that what you're calling identity politics is not useful. I think it's vital, and a vital lens for, talking about economic inequality. End rant.
And let me just clarify. I absolutely don't think that it's completely useless. And if I conveyed that, then that was my mistake.
No.
It's the totalizing impulse and the much larger fraction of people who seem inclined to try to totalize their politics within identity, among people who adopt an identity politics framing that troubles me. I also completely agree with you about the funeral metaphor that you used. There's a great post about there's a great blog post about ring theory. It's called sort of the social circles, the social concentric circles outward from a tragedy or a crisis, at which it's appropriate to communicate. But at the same time, when we're talking about social media, we are talking about the commons. We are talking about the public sphere. And most of the conflict that I've seen over people arguing about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter has taken place on social media. And I think I think what we're seeing is it has at least two parts. I think one part of it is kind of an impulse, is kind of a resisting of the totalizing impulse. And another part that I think kind of plays into that is that there are a lot of parts of this country where I'm in the U.S. right now. There are a lot of parts of this country where lives seem to matter very, very little unless they're lives of the middle class or above. I say this in a car going through Louisiana right now. And there's a lot of people who, particularly after natural disasters, people of all races were basically told, your lives don't matter. I've been visiting relatives down on the Mississippi coast, and it was Katrina, Katrina, Katrina the entire time.
Yeah, so Ed, do you want to throw in
So I guess
anything?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm listening.
Okay, yeah. So I just wanted to jump in and add my previous point before I forget it again, which is that intersectionality is really important, especially when you're considering tactics, because I think one of the risks of identity politics is to say, I'm a member of an oppressed group, therefore anything I do that betters my position is justified. And the problem with that is anyone can identify themselves as the member of an oppressed group, unless you're like the richest white straight male out there, exactly 25 years old, totally healthy. So I think that is one of the risks of identity politics, and I think it's very low on the priorities of things that can actually cause harm, but I do think it makes it very hard to get buy-in from the more general public when they say, well, why is it okay for you to do this when it would be wrong for me to do this? Like, as somebody who's been like a hackerspace administrator and had to try to explain like responding to conflicts between diverse groups of people, it's really hard to explain to someone who is, for example, a white male, why it's okay for one person to do something and not okay for another person to do something.
Yeah.
You were talking about tactics there, and that was also something that Betsy Leondar Wright observed. Some of the groups that she studied were quite militant, very either you're with us or you're against us, and she observed this group interacting with other groups during the protests for the 2008 Democratic National Convention, and their totalizing attitude polarized interactions with other activist groups too, and just made them all less effective.
I've got so some thoughts on particularly what you said, Meredith, and then Ed, what you said about like hacker spaces and stuff is more, I think, more like specific. What do we do? But I think partly this is something that strikes me as the non-American in the group, because I think my experience of politics in the United States is that there is a unique unwillingness to talk about class issues at all. I mean, this is also, it's the case in the UK as well. And what I often hear I've got experience, as I think probably not a lot of people on the American left have, of being in Marxist meetings. We have Marxist parties, small Marxist parties, and that's where I hear people who have dedicated their lives to class activism, often men, say, well, gender doesn't matter and it will all sort itself out after the revolution. And that's the kind of thing that I get cross about, because I'm like, well, can't we have both? Can we have both? We should have both. But actually, in the United States, it seems to me what both Ed and Meredith are kind of getting at, it's not so much a problem of what does identity politics stop us doing as why isn't there more class consciousness, and why is it that Americans find it so hard to talk about this thing. And I don't know, my personal feeling about United States politics is that it's becoming easier in some ways, there's a democratization of talk about gender, about race, about sexuality, but aside from the blip of Occupy, there isn't a way to talk about inequality and what's sad, about socioeconomic inequality, and what is sad is that the only time I do hear it said is in this context, as in, like, it's only possible, for example, it's only possible for men to talk about the class-related ways in which they suffer, in which we all suffer, as a way of shutting down women. Like, that seems to be the only way in which American men are allowed to talk about their problems, whereas actually it should be everywhere. The discussion should be everywhere, because I think there's just a huge cultural fear. Not saying that you guys have it, saying that, like, in America as a whole, I think there's a huge, huge cultural fear about even admitting that class is a thing.
Yeah, and I'm finding, as you're saying that, I'm realizing that most of my unifying, like, why can't we all just get along, which is not true, but my general, like, we have bigger fish to fry, while we deal with these other things as well, has been around class. And so realizing that that is not the top ranked for other people hurts my soul, I'm sure, as much as it hurts other people to realize that gender or sexuality or race is not the top priority for me.
Yeah, go on then.
Do we have any, so some of the identity politics that that are associated with that we've seen succeed have been LGBTQI getting so many rights, right? And which should have had all along, and I've benefited from a long, hard struggle in those ways. And that's one example of when that has really played out well. Do we have other examples of when it's done well, and is that inhibiting our larger unification?
Anyone?
Say again?
So I personally think that Black Lives Matter is being very effective right now, because because a lot of the demands that it's making are both general and specific, like the demand for an end to police violence as a way of drawing attention to systemic injustice faced by people of color, particularly young people of color. And I think, to be honest, I think the All Lives Matter thing is an outlier in that I think for people like us who care about language and care about rhetoric, it's actually, it's easy to approach it as a, hey, this is an interesting dialectic. But actually for most people who are using these, I think there may be, like, I can say this because we're on a private list, I think we may be being a little intellectual about this.
We are broadcasting, but we are being really intellectual about it.
I think a lot of the people who are using All Lives Matter maybe don't have the, haven't thought it through in the way that we're thinking it through. They're just being racist. They're just using it to shut down Black Lives Matter. I mean, I've just come back from a Donald Trump rally in South Carolina, and they definitely weren't thinking about the, discursive affect of saying of all lives versus Black lives. They just wanted the people saying Black Lives Matter to shut up.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, I think that's what's happening with that in particular.
I've been continually impressed by the successes on multiple fronts of Black Lives Matter. I think it's really exciting.
Just want to mention that some of the Black Lives Matter's organizers presented at Allied Media over this past summer, and there's a post on the Civic blog about it, about networks for organizing, and they had some really cool stuff to say about how their kind of networking tactics have helped them be successful.
Awesome, thank you.
I'd be interested to know what you guys think is not working. As
Meredith, that's for you, because I think things are great.
Well, it's kind of one of those where to start questions. I mean, where are things not working? I mean, certainly, okay. I mean, fine. We'll make the if the person is the person was political, then let's go. I mean, I have a real problem, for instance, with feminist groups like the geek feminism wiki maintainers who throw other women under the bus when those women are being attacked. At the moment, the the shitheads at Pando Daily have been kicking up their harassment of Andrea Shepherd again. Threatening to come to 32C3 and basically just working on intimidating her. This is round two of the BS that they were pulling last year. And when Andrea, went to the geek feminist, folks like Lee Honeywell begging for help, they laughed her off because she has ideological cooties as far as they're concerned. And I'm sorry, if you're throwing women under the bus, you don't actually get to claim you're a feminist. And I think that this is really a facet of totalizing identity politics taking over. If you're not our kind of woman, you don't get to be a woman, and that's just not right.
I would say, Meredith, that throwing other women under the bus is a time-honored tradition of feminist activism, and so
well, that's a tradition that needs to end because throwing people ending the throwing of people under the bus is kind of our goal here.
Yeah, I don't know. The road to destroying patriarchy seems to be paved with other women, like since the 70s, 80s, and beyond. So this is not a new thing. And whilst I don't think it means that feminism is broken, I think there's huge policing of who gets to be a woman. Whether that is, the big one at the moment. The big two are like, are you a real woman if you're a trans woman or genderqueer, and are you a real feminist if you are an ally or a sex worker? And those arguments are older than any of us. And to me, this is just recreating patriarchal ideas. It's like, we don't need the patriarchy to judge who's the best woman. We'll do it ourselves. We'll have that competition all ourselves. And God, yeah, I can do without that. So yeah, I don't think this is the nature of feminism, but it is the big stumbling block.
I think that it's also it's upsetting because it's even further hypocrisy, because some people in those groups are considered to be able to not do anything wrong because they're a part of the group, and then other people who should be a part of the group under something like identity politics are not included. But I don't necessarily think that that's an issue with identity politics. I think that that's something that happens often under that banner, but that it has more to do with the individuals that are a part of it. Meredith,
Really, I guess the question I'm asking is, why does identity politics seem to attract a larger percentage of totalizers than other political ideologies do? I mean, because I don't really run into a whole lot of totalizing libertarians. Most of the libertarians I know just want to go off and be left alone to be by themselves and let everybody else do whatever it is they want to do. The two major political parties in the U.S. and most of the political parties in Belgium, with the exception of Vlaams Belang, mainly seem focused on what can we do to cooperate.
I think that's a big and important distinction, right? Between the what can we do to cooperate and the just leave us alone people. And I think the just leave us alone, that's kind of is answered itself, right? Because if your entire politics is based on everybody goes off and does their own thing and anything goes, then there's only so far you can go with that in terms of changing the world and building solidarity. But it makes you much less likely to fight among yourselves about who's got the best politics. I don't know. I think the left eats itself so much, and certainly coming again from a culture which has infinite tiny factions of Marxists and anarchists and anarcho-Marxists and deep anarchists and Marxist Leninists and Trotskyists. They do this too, right? I think, and that's actually one thing you don't have in the US is the infinite infighting between the organized left, the organized far left, which doesn't call itself identity politics, but you see exactly the same thing going on. And there's the biggest thing I've been able to pinpoint, in my not so many years is just that ideas are all we have in these groups. And I think particularly for younger people, when they just come into the movements, like they're not in it for money or power or not political kind of financial power anyway. They're in it to be good people. But their idea of being good people, particularly when they're young, is to have the best politics ever. And it just seems to me like school. It seems to me like, rather than being the popular kids, we'll be the most Marxist and the best feminists, and nobody else can sit at our table. Anyway,
Yeah,
Ed.
Leander Wright also. Oh, yeah. Sorry, that was going to go. I was just going to say, Leander Wright also observes that this tendency happens most in people with a middle to upper class background. Like lifelong working class people don't really get that. They don't really get that bug.
I'm just thinking about that. I'm not sure that's true in my experience, but it might be. Ed.
What do you think about things?
Okay, I'm trying to take notes here. Let's see. So, going way back to the class stuff, I was surprised to hear Lori question that we pay attention to class, because like I've heard a lot about it, but it has always been in the context of, oh well, I suffer too, So I think the real challenge is finding ways to say, you've suffered, I've suffered, going back to what can we do to cooperate. And and I think that's really challenging because it requires more effort, and competing over politics and saying, I've got the best politics, I'm the most righteous, feels good, right? And that's not necessarily bad. But it's bad when that is actually impeding doing good work and reducing harm and actually helping people. So I guess that's my input.
Well, thanks. Hey, Lori.
I mean, I'd like to hear what Ed and Meredith have to say about the original question, and why is SJW a derogatory term, and I like why this came up as a thing, because I think this discussion is fascinating, but I'm interested in how we got into it, because for me, the people who use SJW as a derogatory term are mainly like gamergators, and I associate it more with people whose main goal seems to be just shutting down women and people of color, but often specifically women and specifically feminists. And I'm more interested in identity politics, because I think that is, as a contested term. Because I have seen identity politics used by, I guess I would say people I take more seriously, in terms of I don't think they're just out to hate on people. I think they're out to, they think they're trying to do a good thing. Does that make sense?
Well, the first place I actually ran into the term social justice warrior was on Reddit, on Tumblr in Action, well over a year before Boing Boing started pointing at it. It had been in use for a pretty long time, and there's actually a distinction was being used in the groups where I saw it on Reddit that has disappeared in the broader discourse. Specifically, a distinction drawn between social justice and social justice warriors. Where on the one hand you've got people who have certain beliefs about actions we could take to ensure a more just world for everybody, versus people who use that framing as a way to punch people for fun. And there are a lot of people who do that. but the derogatory social justice warrior term was definitely used to refer to to people who again are trying to totalize their politics.
Yeah, and I think that is at least the caricature of what people are complaining about. The idea of someone who says, "I'm oppressed, you're not oppressed, everything I do is good, everything you do is bad," and then use that for their own self-gain. Whether or not that actually exists is questionable. But I think that perception really exists, and a lot of that goes back to what I was saying about it being really hard for people to understand identity politics and how the baseline favors certain groups of people, and needing to find a way to convey to them that, yes, this person is saying that in order to achieve greater equality, we have to treat different groups differently, but for good reason. And I think that sometimes those reasons are explained well, sometimes they're not. Sometimes people don't care enough to see what those reasons are. So that's kind of where I see it stemming from.
I don't know. I find it very interesting because for me, I don't know. I come out of a lot of, like the British left and then kind of feminist organizing, and then I started hearing social justice warrior about a year and a half ago, mainly like directed at me. I get like an insane amount of harassment, I should say. So, and a lot of like 90% of the times I hear social justice warriors, justice warrior is people yelling at me. So this is skewing my viewpoint here, but to me it's just confusing because if coming from outside these circles, like you think, hey, like why is it bad? Why is social justice is bad now? Did I miss something? Like I thought we all liked this. I don't know. I think it comes back to where are the spaces and where can the spaces be for men to talk about class without, in a way that's not shutting down women, for white people to talk about class in a way that's not just shutting down people of color. And I'm not sure how we create that in the United States. I know that there are more spaces for that, I think, in Europe, even though there's not, obviously there's not enough, but it seems to be at least a discussion that's being had in a way that's not being had here. And so in many ways, people's energies are being diverted back into identity politics, or what you're calling identity politics, partly because that seems to be what's working. It seems to be where gains are being made. And I think sometimes people, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not from the country or the class where this would be a part of my daily existence, but it feels like in America there's just a belief that you can't change class politics at all. There's a total hopelessness and a total, unwillingness to even look at it. And so people want to do stuff that they feel is working, or feel that has a possibility of working, and particularly with race and gender politics, it seems like maybe that it's a long shot, but it's less of a long shot. That's just me pontificating. Like, that's not me speaking.
People feel like they can escape their class, but not that they can change what the class dynamics are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Meredith?
Yeah. There we go, mute button. You brought up Gamergate a second ago, and that actually ties into another one of the problems I've seen. People will derail an argument all day long over whether an act of suppressing someone's speech counts as censorship, but in Massachusetts, Zoe Quinn filed a restraining order against Aaron Gioni, which was written by the court so as to restrict him from talking about any of his experiences that led to him writing the Zoe post at all. And that's called prior restraint, and that's a violation of the right to free speech that the Supreme Court has traditionally been very, very, very serious about defending. It's probably not going to leave the Massachusetts appellate courts. It's being decided right now. But the fact that people are willing to totalize their politics so far as to engage in what the Supreme Court defines as a form of censorship and says is not allowed in this country, that really, really bugs me. Like, especially when it's coming from, when defenses of this are coming from people who also position themselves as anti-censorship.
I didn't know that that was going on. So the restraining order is saying that he can't write. Basically, he can't write about her anymore. Or I think I've lost.
You're on mute. There it is. Come back. There it is. There you are.
Sorry, mute button. Yeah, mute button was misbehaving. The restraining order has actually been lifted now because she actually rescinded it herself. But he was not allowed by the restraining order to say anything about her or his experiences with the ongoing court proceedings. Like, he wasn't supposed to, to tweet about anything related to his own defense or anything like that. I mean, he was completely denied a voice in the public sphere for anything having to do with this case that he was involved in, and that's the kind of restriction that that the U.S. has traditionally been very, very opposed to.
On the other hand, I mean, I would say, again, not knowing all the specifics of the case, but it does seem that probably not through this guy's fault or intention originally, anything he writes or anything anybody writes about Zoe and their relationship, particularly what he writes, is used as basis for unbelievable harassment towards her. And I think it's fair to assume that anything he would write or say about their relationship would be misused and weaponized and used to further threaten and bully and abuse Zoe. And I can see a rationale for that. I mean, I'm not an American. The attitude to free speech here is not something I grew up taking on trust, and it fascinates me deeply. But I don't come from a culture or a kind of intellectual background where I believe that where free speech absolutism means the same thing. I believe that people's right to free speech is like, I don't think you can negotiate freedom in a vacuum, basically. I think there are kinds of free speech that deny the free speech of other people, and it's about negotiating that. I think it seems like for this guy, anything he writes about Zoe Quinn is going to be the equivalent for her probably of shouting fire in a crowded theatre, and that's kind of not all on him. That's not all. I don't think he intended it that way. I hope he didn't, but that's what's happened. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I think that this can really be turned around. I mean, because imagine that it was, say, a Black Lives Matter protester in the same place, and imagine that somebody had hit them with a restraining order that prevented them from doing any of their activism. And I'm not claiming that what Aaron might want to talk about is activism per se, but I think that a person is, case law normally holds that a person is allowed to defend themselves. He wasn't even allowed to talk about the ongoing events in the restraining order case. He wasn't allowed to talk about the fact that there was a restraining order. He wasn't allowed to talk about the fact that she filed several during the period when the restraining order was in effect. She construed several things that he had said as being about her even when they weren't, and tried to have him jailed for violating the restraining order. I mean, at what point do you say, okay, we have to look at this as an attack intended to silence a person, as opposed to what you said earlier, trying to find that balance? Because I I've having looked at the text of the restraining order, I just can't imagine how any judge ever signed this because of how broad it was. Had it been very narrowly construed, like you were talking about, we could be having that conversation, but it wasn't. She pushed for and she got the totalizing result.
Let me have a look at the restraining order thing.
So I think we're into another topic, which I think is another thing that we've been talking about recently, which is the balance of how we deal with how we're being awful to each other in the overlap of online-offline space, and how when trying to call in enforcement and our legal systems, they don't know how to handle it, and also we're in an age where more people distrust those systems than ever before, or at least more visibly than before, and that is further complicating the space that we're in right now. Does that make sense? So I want to be aware of our time, not only because I have other meetings that I need to do today, but let's hear some last reflections from everyone. And while you do that, I am going to try to come up with a synthesizing comment for the whole thing. So Ed, do you want to lead us out with that?
Yeah, so I want to come back to tactics. I think that's a really helpful way to think about things. In the end, it doesn't really matter what your politics are if you agree on tactics. And something that we kind of saw coming up again and again was whether or not a tactic is meant to silence someone, and that seems like a really good mental check to think about. So I'll leave it at that.
Ready?
Sure. Yeah. Just to address the point you brought up about the disconnect between between offline and online and how we handle conflict. One bit of silver lining, at least, is that police departments are starting to are starting to take online harassment and some of the forms it can take more seriously. A lot of police departments around the country now have basically a swatting register. So if you're being mobbed online, call your local police department, see if they can, see if they can put your address on a list that will be checked anytime someone calls to report, a violent incident someplace, so that they can, so they have a better idea of whether it's real or whether this is somebody trying to get the cops to show up at your door. So, I mean, I think that's a great step, and I think that, as much as activists hate to work with the police, I think, working with law enforcement to try to give them a better understanding and disseminate that better understanding throughout the rest of law enforcement will help reconcile that disconnect.
This has been a great discussion, and I want to say thanks for you guys for being part of it, and thanks to Willow for organising and sharing. And I think for me the most important thing is the disconnect between the artificial binary of identity politics versus class politics, and how there needs to be more space to talk about class politics, particularly in the US, without that being a way of shutting down particularly women and people of colour. But I guess in closing, I would say that I think it's important to remember that this harassment is happening, and that for many people, many people, self included, the attacks on free speech on our free speech that we are experiencing, you kind of, you have to experience it to believe it in some ways, and it's a constant daily battle and a constant mental health battle. And I think some people, there are different levels of feeling silenced and being silenced online. And I understand that for particularly guys, particularly people in positions of privilege, there is a feeling of, you can feel attacked when people are pushing back on things that you're saying, but the attacks that, I guess, quote unquote, social justice warriors are experiencing are enormous, and evidence that what they're saying is really threatening in a way that is not necessarily, I mean, I don't consider it's not necessarily threatening individuals as much as it is threatening a worn and warped status quo. And maybe Willow can sum up, because I don't necessarily feel like I deserve the last word here.
I'm glad to. So one, thank you all so much for giving your valuable time and emotional and cognitive energy to this. It's an honor to have you here. And the thing that I want to reference back to is how we are going from individual conflict or even small group conflict to these more, we're making the systemic tensions more visible because all of this is happening in documented space, right, and in online space. And so in the same way that Meredith referenced a Reddit thread that had concerns of the difference between social justice and social justice warrior, and the social justice warrior using the social justice rhetoric in order to hit people because they wanted to hit people, we're also now seeing people who just don't like or feel threatened by the changes that go along with reaching more equality in the world now being targeted towards anyone who says they're a social justice warrior, either because they want to punch people because they want to punch people, and that's the framing that they're using, or if they truly believe in it and are invested in it. And sometimes those are the tactics they take. And so I think we have a lot further to go, and I think that I will continue to trust in humanity to sort these things out, even when they break my heart. But yeah, let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you, guys.
And I'll stop the broadcast, and then we can hang out a little bit longer if you want to. But, goodbye, world.